I'd like you to consider this: a team that you have spent years building. Smart people with a clear purpose and a watertight process. It's the kind of team that has consistently delivered. But then something shifts. So a deadline approaches, the score narrows, a competitor moves. And almost overnight, you watch that same team start to unravel. So meetings get tense, decision-making quality suffers, composure disappears, and the people who usually speak up suddenly go quiet. Now, nothing obvious has broken, but something clearly has. And here is what I want to suggest. And I'll warn you up front, it might be slightly uncomfortable. I believe the leadership playbook that most of us were trained on, the one built around purpose, on process, on relentless execution, on its own, is no longer sufficient. Not because it was wrong, I think it was beautifully suited to the world it was designed for. The problem is, that world no longer exists. And I think most leaders haven't fully reckoned with what that means. So here is a way to think about it. Imagine a bridge engineered decades ago for a certain load. The cars, the trucks, the traffic of its era. And for years, that bridge has carried that load beautifully. But then someone doubles the traffic. Then they triple it. Then they start running heavy freight across that bridge around the clock. Now, the bridge isn't built badly. The materials are sound, but the design assumptions no longer match the load. That, in my view, is what is happening to many organizational cultures. It's the assumption that change is occasional. It's the assumption that our strategy is stable and future-proofed. It's the assumption that the environment is something you can adapt to and then kind of settle back into. But none of these assumptions hold anymore. Research by Forbes tracking the rate of change across key business domains, for example, technology, regulation, and customer behavior, found it has risen by 183% since 2019 alone. McKinsey describes continuous change not as a phase, but as a permanent operating condition. And in a recent survey, 3 out of 4 Australian business leaders said their organization had evolved more in the past 4 years than in the previous 2 decades. What we can conclude from this is that change isn't a phase. Change is now the permanent operating environment. Now, you might be thinking, my team has a strong purpose. They know their why, and we've got watertight processes. Errol, doesn't this carry us through in these times? Here is what I have learned through my years of working with elite sporting and executive teams. Purpose and process are essential. There is no doubt about that. They answer 2 very specific questions. So, why do we exist? And how do we operate when the conditions are stable? However, under pressure, a 3rd question shows up that neither purpose nor process was designed to answer. And that question is, how do we coordinate, recalibrate, and decide together when the situation is changing faster than the plan? The answer, in my view, is a capability organizations rarely attend to. Think of this as the layer underneath purpose and process that directly impacts how people work together, how they collaborate, and how they make meaning in the midst of fast changing and complex environments. I want to be concrete about what's in that layer because culture on its own it's too vague to act on. So this layer comes down to three things: trust, whether people can rely on each other; connection, how we engage with each other; and finally, inclusion, the extent to which diverse voices shape decisions and direction. Trust, connection, and inclusion form the cultural infrastructure through which people collaborate, through how they learn, and how they adapt in real time. These are what I call the three pillars of adaptive safety. And crucially, they don't just show up by accident. They actually had to be intentionally built with focus. And here is why this matters more than anything else I'm going to say in this video. When that cultural infrastructure is fragile or it's missing, pressure produces fear. And fear produces the behaviors we all recognize. So behaviors like defensiveness, avoidance, blame, siloing, or the slow narrowing of voices in the room. The team still has its purpose. It still has its process even, but under load, neither of them is enough to hold the team together. However, when that cultural infrastructure is in place, the same pressure produces something completely different: focus, adaptation, what athletes call flow or being in the zone. It's the state where teams perform at their peak precisely because the stakes are high. So it's the same team, same purpose, same process, but a different cultural infrastructure underneath. The difference between fear and flow comes down to almost entirely this: the move from fear to flow isn't a personality trait, and it's definitely not a motivational poster. It's a design choice, and it's something that needs to be built with focus and with intention. So here is the question I would leave you with. If you knew that the way your team behaves under pressure was the truest test of its culture, what would you change starting tomorrow morning? So, what conversations have you been avoiding? How can you name and therefore bring awareness to the subtle shifts in trust, connection, and inclusion? And then recognize the specific behaviors which contributed to these shifts. The world has changed, but the good news, at least in my opinion, is we can change the way we lead. So in the weeks ahead, I'll continue to unpack the framework I have developed called adaptive safety, the next evolution in how high-performing teams operate, and the central idea behind my new book, From Fear to Flow, The Adaptive Safety Revolution. If this video resonates, please hit subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.